During the US interventions of the early 2000s in Iraq and Afghanistan, American soldiers found themselves under constant siege by a weapon more insidious than most: the roadside bomb, also known as an improvised explosive device or an IED. Functionally, a do-it-yourself version of a landmine, the IED was, and still is, a primary weapon of insurgency in both those nations. IEDs require no direct confrontation with American troops, they require no firefight or hit-and-run attack, and they could be placed around the country, just about anywhere, to cause the Americans pain in their own back lines, far from where they had thought the enemy was. To solve such a dangerous problem, the United States needed a dangerous solution, one that could stand up to the threat of roadside bombs and keep that same energy when it went on the attack. And boy, did they get one. Massive trucks weighing anywhere between 12 and 28 tons. The mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicle known as the MRAP are a class all their own. They are scary levels of resilience, able to take otherworldly amounts of punishment and keep on rolling. In today's episode of Mega Projects, we're going to explore the entire class of MRAP tanks, the war machine that eats landmines for breakfast. Now, before we get into how the MRAP came about, it's important to note that we're not just talking about one vehicle here. We're talking about an entire class of heavy military truck, all with the same basic goal in mind. In order to qualify as an MRAP, a truck's got to be able to do two things: resist high explosives at extremely close proximity, and provide resilient enough armor on all sides that if a convoy or even a lone truck were to be ambushed, the people inside it would remain safe. That means that by default, an MRAP will be far more resilient than most other military vehicles, specifically the light Jeep, best known in the modern American military arsenal as the Humvee, as well as its successor, the JTLV. And by the way, we've done a whole other video on the Humvee on this channel, so do check it out after watching this one if you want to learn more about that. Now, in order to provide this sort of protection against heavy weapons, the MRAP will generally have a few key characteristics, regardless of the company that's designed it. The first, and undeniably the most important, is its incredible armor. The body of an MRAP includes a large crew capsule with a driver's seat up front and room inside for about half a dozen soldiers, equipment, cargo, or a combination between them. Underneath those soldiers' feet, the capsule will almost always be shaped into a V, pointing at the ground below, a critical measure to angle the force of an explosion away from the crew above. This is in sharp contrast to the flat-bottomed Humvee designed before the days of widespread IEDs, and it's a critical lesson from the many instances in which soldiers have lost their lives due to that design issue. The MRAP's underbelly is designed with the thickness to repel or avoid shrapnel, while the seats inside are built to be energy absorbing to prevent shockwaves from traveling up through the soldiers' bodies and damaging their internal organs. Also, in the name of protecting its passengers, the MRAP will generally be equipped with internal life support systems capable of providing ventilation, oxygen, protection against nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons coming from outside, as well as extreme heat and cold. And on the outside, it's coated in inches-thick armor plating, precisely shaped and machined so that there are no cracks for bullets, mortars, or even shockwaves to penetrate. The MRAP will always be outfitted with internal fire suppression systems, and it's built to drive in hard terrain in all weather conditions and with or without the luxury of a road. It's equipped with tires designed to work even if one of them or two of them have gone flat, and even those tires are built to withstand direct gunfire or explosions. The MRAP's internal systems can typically function automatically, and in many cases they're equipped with a turret or gun mount and a winch to help with self-recovery from crashes or rollovers. With all of these features, the MRAP could be pinned down and surrounded in a valley by enemies above, stranded out in the desert or the tundra by itself, or even buried under rubble, and even in such a disadvantageous situation, it will have the armor and critical functions to keep its passengers alive and either get them out safely or protect them long enough for help to arrive. Now, while the modern MRAP is synonymous with the American military and its global partners, the MRAP story actually begins during South Africa's incursions into neighboring countries during the 1980s, where in each of its conflicts, and especially its occupation of the area now known as the country of Namibia, South African soldiers found themselves battling the large-scale use of landmines as a primary instrument of war. By that time, this was nothing new. Mines had been an inescapable part of World War II and many of the conflicts that followed, but South Africa was the first to develop a vehicle that wouldn't be expressly kept out of a certain area simply because there were landmines there. First introduced in 1980, South Africa built and mass-produced its Caspier Mine Protected Vehicle, or MPV. It's a four-wheel drive vehicle sitting at a height of over 9 feet, that's nearly 3 meters, and with a length of 22.5 feet or 7 meters. The nearly 11-ton Caspier was capable of carrying a dozen soldiers and their equipment across rough terrain. Capable of withstanding both mine detonations and small arms fire, the Caspier featured multiple heavy cannons as well as firing ports for the soldiers inside, meaning that one single truck was functionally a fast-moving fortress compared to the bands of rebels trying to stop it. These trucks, aptly nicknamed Citadels, were the start of a long list of variants and subsequent generations, and when the United States came looking for an MRAP design in the early 2000s, the qualities they defined in an MRAP of choice basically mirrored the example that the Caspier had set. And not only was the Caspier a unique and powerful example of a new type of military vehicle, but it did a great job at showing just how versatile an MRAP design could be. Various Caspiers were modified into armored personnel carriers, mine detector trucks, drug detector trucks, heavy freighters, and military or civilian police vehicles. They were used as ambulances, fire support trucks for either infantry or artillery, and specialized mine-clearing vehicles were outfitted with metal wheels meant to literally drive over landmines in order to clear them. They've been adapted into roles as water or fuel tankers, reconnaissance trucks, hook lifts, and even so-called gun tractors, the very embodiment of get off my farm energy. They've been used from the United States to India, from Angola to Mali to Mozambique, and they've bred a long line of successors from the highly effective Buffalo to the even more highly esteemed Mamba. So once they were available, South Africa's early MRAPs became a hallmark of United Nations peacekeeping operations around the world, partly because they could keep said peacekeepers safe in a crisis, and partly because they did just as well as military vehicles as they did serving diplomatic roles. But the MRAP wouldn't be seen again in large-scale wars until the United States arrived in Iraq following the attacks of September the 11th. In the early days of the American intervention there, the United States learned that its mechanized forces had a major gap in capability. Its heavily armored M1 tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles were too limited to fight an asymmetrical war and had the side effect of making the local population nervous to cooperate or even show their faces, while its Humvees and other so-called soft-skinned trucks couldn't stand up to IEDs. Humvees were especially unlucky in Iraq. Tasked with patrolling far-flung areas on poorly kept roads, they stumbled upon roadside bombs more frequently than any other piece of American equipment, and the results were always the same. Catastrophic and often lethal internal damage in the soldiers' bodies due to shockwaves and shrapnel, plus horrific burns caused by the blast and resulting fires. No matter what the US military did to fortify its Humvee against attack, the machines were just incapable of doing the job, and that meant that in order to keep the troops safe, the American offensive operations had to be dramatically slowed down to accommodate minesweeper teams. At the same time, stories of American service members killed or wounded by IEDs had a massively harmful effect on public perceptions of the war, bad enough that the IED risked running the US out of Iraq and Afghanistan entirely due to public pressure. So, it must have been with incredible relief and probably a bit of jealousy that a US team sent to South Africa witnessed a Caspier roll through a live minefield basically undamaged. Quickly, the US understood that an MRAP was precisely the antidote to its IED problem, and they sought out an initial order of the vehicles from the British Royal Engineers, whose recent acquisition, the Tempest Protection Patrol Vehicle design, would be able to stand up to this sort of assault. Before long, the US Marines were requesting their first hardened engineer vehicles, or HEVs, an MRAP-like design that would feature a low center of gravity in addition to its other attributes. Since MRAP armor is placed all throughout a vehicle, its center of gravity tends to be high, leading to a high rate of rollovers, which, of course, never really comes at a good time. But with the improvements the Marines requested, an initial contingent of 54 vehicles rolled onto the battlefield within a few years, and the results were absolutely unmistakable. Marine deaths due to IEDs basically disappeared. In the following months, the Marines pushed hard to acquire more MRAPs, and when they did, their performance was outstanding. Their first-generation MRAPs, a design called the Cougar that was manufactured by Force Protection, were involved in over 300 IED incidents by the end of their first year in service, but not a single Marine or other passenger died in those explosions. Before long, the US Department of Defense had started a pan-military MRAP program with the intent of procuring a much wider variety of the vehicles and sending them to a variety of forces and operational units. The DoD looked for MRAPs in 3 categories: smaller, lighter, mine-resistant utility vehicles, mid-sized joint rapid response vehicles, and large, heavy trucks that could be used for mine clearing. Over the better part of the following decade, the DoD would procure nearly 28,000 MRAPs for service in every corner of the US military. So, what exactly are the MRAPs that the Americans eventually went with? And the short answer is there's a whole lot of them, each with between a few dozen and a few thousand copies in service. Because of how similar these designs tend to be, we're going to run through the major ones here rather than belaboring the point with an entire series of videos. But if there are any particular MRAPs that you'd really like to see covered at greater length, and you've got a good reason for it, let me know in the comments below. Now, first up, we've got the light mine-resistant vehicles that make up MRAP Category 1, starting with Navistar's International Max Pro, quite the name. With over 9,000 copies produced beginning in 2007, the Max Pro is a truck weighing between 12.5 and 14.5 tons, depending on the variant. At a length of 23.5 feet and a height of 10 feet, the Max Pro is a pretty imposing sight, powered by a 330 horsepower engine with the ability to add another 5 tons of payload. It's a very powerful vehicle compared to most alternatives in the field. The Max Pro is built with a high ground clearance, giving it better protection from blast, and it features a computerized stability control system that autocorrects its driver during elaborate or dangerous maneuvers. The Max Pro is built to be very easily maintained in the field, and it's capable of enduring direct hits from a 15-pound landmine with no injury to its occupants. It's been adapted into extra-large versions, tow trucks that can recover other vehicles while under fire, and command post trucks featuring internal monitors, comms equipment, and computers, plus an onboard generator. The Max Pro has become extremely popular worldwide, with Pakistan, Jordan, and the UAE among its most faithful users, and several hundred of them have been sent to Ukraine. And then there's the Cayman, made by BAE Systems, with over 1,000 copies produced. These two were a favorite of the US Marines, built with the capacity to house a 10-man crew inside a capsule of composite armor that can be further reinforced. A highly advanced design for its time, the Cayman features the option to mount remote weapons, and it includes 85% parts compatibility with other BAE designs, ensuring that it can be easily resupplied and maintained in the field. Notably, its floor is designed in a way that further reduces the impact of blast even beyond what its shock-absorbing seats and hull already accomplish. In addition to its service with the US military, the Cayman has proliferated around the world, mostly in Egypt and the UAE, with the UAE specifically picking up over 1,100 of them. Rounding out the Category 1 MRAPs we'll discuss today is the Cougar, made by Force Protection. First produced all the way back in 2002, the Cougar sits at an empty weight of 14.5 tons, and it's somewhat smaller than the prior designs at a height of 8 2/3 feet and a length of under 20 feet. It's got capacity for 4 passengers and 2 crew, and at just under $500,000 a pop, it was the first major MRAP selection of the US Marine Corps. The Cougar features a top speed of 65 miles an hour, with the potential to operate at a 600-mile range, and it's also a favorite of the British military, who use several variants as counter IED and tactical support trucks. Poland, in particular, loves the Cougar, so does Iraq, and it was a favorite of the US paramilitary company Blackwater, now Academy, during their long tenure in the Middle East. The Cougar, in particular, is good at enduring the rigors of long-range travel, and in many ways, it was the example against which all later MRAPs have been judged. So next up we move into MRAP Category 2, the bigger, badder trucks that can handle even more punishment than the ones we've already discussed. In addition to a supplemental larger 6x6 version of the Cougar that we just talked about, there's the RG-33, also made by BAE Systems, like the Cayman. According to live fire tests done by BAE, the RG-33 is the most survivable MRAP on the market, with options to convert it into an armored ambulance or a command and control vehicle. Although it's typically built in a Category 1 design, it's been optioned in a heavy 6-wheeler design that's capable of even more incredible feats of endurance than it had already achieved. In the coming years, the RG-33 will be outfitted with anti-sniper systems as well as anti-explosive armor that go significantly beyond what it's currently capable of. Similarly, there's the expanded version of the RG-31 Nyla, working in primary service to the UN and other non-governmental organizations, working in landmined areas but not looking to cause harm. The extended Nyla features even better protection than the base version, plus the option to carry several more troops or passengers inside. And last of all, there's the real heavy hitter of the MRAP world, Force Protection's Buffalo, a 6-wheeled truck whose sole purpose is to clear explosive ordnance and deal with the consequences of when it goes off. In order to deal with that ordnance, the Buffalo is outfitted with an articulated robotic arm that can dig up IEDs or mines by itself without putting troops in any harm's way. The Buffalo features so-called cage armor, thick and tightly packed bars that can shield against explosions at close range, and the glass on the vehicle is 6 inches thick. It comes complete with infrared technology to identify ordnance, plus a mounted camera and sensory equipment on the robotic arm. Sitting at a height of 13 feet and a length of 26 feet, it's a whole lot bigger than most other MRAPs, and at over 22 tons, it's more than heavy enough to laugh off even the most formidable mines. Its wheels are fitted with run-flat tires so that it can keep on moving even if every wheel is punctured, and when its wheels are undamaged, this behemoth can still hit a top speed of 65 miles an hour. About 650 are in service to the US, while Pakistan, Canada, and the UK each have a handful of their own. And as much as it's great to study all the MRAPs that have worked spectacularly, we've also got to pay brief tribute to the ones that didn't for various reasons. The Oshkosh Alpha, initially marketed to phase out the Humvee, was being built using technology that was offered for use in NASCAR racetrack walls to shield against crashes, but it ultimately wasn't survivable enough to make the cut. An MRAP version of Textron's M1117 Guardian went by the wayside as well when it failed ballistics testings in 2007. And finally, the Israeli-made Golan MRAP was discarded outright by the Marines after 60 copies of its prototype had already been provided, and at present it hasn't been picked up by the Israeli military either. Now, once the United States military decided to adopt the MRAP at large scale, it quickly emerged in force across Iraq and Afghanistan. Over 10,000 of the machines were produced within 18 months, so many in fact that they became a mainstay not just of the US operations in those countries, but of the operations done by American coalition partners. And by all accounts, the MRAP was a resounding success, though concrete figures have ever been released on how many lives were saved by the MRAP, at least not publicly, mostly due to security concerns around how that data might be useful to American enemies abroad. However, the US Department of Defense has lauded the MRAP as having the lowest casualty rates of any vehicle in Iraq or Afghanistan, which is a striking statistic given how many of the trucks were produced and just how large a role they had played in traversing exceptionally dangerous territory. Now, it's important to note that even though MRAPs can grant protection against explosions and roadside bombs that would otherwise kill the soldiers inside, they're not infallible. Bombs that are larger than the standard IED, and sometimes quite a bit larger, will obviously cause substantially more damage, and even in situations when the people inside do survive the blast, they're likely to be badly wounded. These larger explosions can come from anywhere from car bombs to stationary targets to much heavier, deliberately placed MRAP killer IEDs on the roadside. Even in these cases, it's far better to be in an MRAP than not, as US Defense Secretary Robert Gates put during his tenure. Thousands and thousands of lives have been saved, and multiples of that in terms of limbs. In the field, MRAPs proved to be 14 times safer for their occupants than a Humvee, and although a few poorly designed studies attempted to poke holes in the argument during the early 2010s, the MRAP's results really do speak for themselves. In terms of their reception by soldiers, MRAPs have been something of a mixed bag. On the one hand, it's just about a unanimous opinion among the armed forces that use them that if you're going to get blown up, it's a hell of a lot more appealing to do it in an MRAP than in a Humvee. But in many circles, that's where the praise can end, especially with MRAPs fielded by the United States. On one hand, MRAPs are prone to severe bouncing when in rough terrain, so bad that soldiers toward the rear of the vehicle are likely to receive neck and head injuries from hitting the roof. And there are open questions about the MRAP design's functionality. Despite the fact that several soldiers can sit in the back, most designs have seats facing inward toward the vehicle and a lack of viewports, which essentially means that these soldiers, who could be firing outward from a protected spot while the truck is in motion, instead have no option to do so. It's a story of lost potential, sacrificed in order to create a sealable container to survive nuclear, biological, and chemical attacks. But in a world where MRAP producers in South Africa had started putting outward-facing seats and viewports on their vehicles decades ago, it's historically been difficult for many MRAP passengers to reconcile it. But through it all, US service members have had no better option than the MRAP to ensure that they're kept safe. According to the US DoD, the MRAP suffers just a 6% casualty rate. That's opposed to a 15% casualty rate for the M1 Abrams tank and a 22% rate for the Humvee. Now, away from the front lines and in parts of the world reeling from the after effects of war, MRAPs play a crucial role in keeping humanitarian aid workers safe. Sometimes these are workers tasked with bringing relief to a village located on the far side of a known minefield. At other times, they're used to cross badlands full of insurgent forces in order to ferry personnel and supplies into areas where they're needed most. They've shown the hardiness required to forge through areas disrupted by national disaster, including in the United States, where they've been used to evacuate people from the path of a hurricane or a ford of rising floodwaters. For these purposes, the machines undergo significant refits. It's simply not a good look as a humanitarian to be riding around with a gun turret on top of your armored car. But where MRAPs in the civilian world get a lot more controversial is in policing. In the United States, MRAP trucks have shown up in service to federal, state, and even local police departments, granting cities and towns some serious heavy equipment. In fact, the program that the US used to give out its surplus MRAPs was a mandate passed down from Congress, meaning that they had to make their way into local police and sheriff's departments. It's important to note here that some of the more explicitly troubling bits of the MRAP are generally removed before being sent to the police departments. For example, there's the very real town of Oblong, Illinois. It's important to note here that some of the more explicitly troubling bits of the MRAP are generally removed before being sent to the police department. That includes things like, the massive robotic gun on top. But even still, the machines are generally seen as fairly egregious overkill in the cities they patrol, especially amidst broader conversations about just how much military surplus, including the lethal stuff that cities and towns are receiving. It's the same general idea as not wanting to show up to international humanitarian work while driving an armor-plated monster truck. It doesn't really scream, "I'm on your side." Recently, European manufacturers have started offering their own MRAPs to police organizations, and they've shown up in France as recently as the 2023 riots. Within the United States military and the militaries of the world, MRAPs continue to be a vital part of the overall vehicle arsenal. In Ukraine, hundreds are currently in service, fighting back against the Russian invasion. And in the Middle East and North Africa, the UAE's stores of thousands of MRAPs see service in a wide range of hot zones. NASA even has a few MRAPs in case of emergency evacuation from spacecraft launch pads. In the US, the Army is in the process of phasing out most of its MRAPs to be replaced by the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, although thousands will remain in storage in case they're ever needed. In total, the Pentagon's procurement initiatives were responsible for adding 27,740 MRAPs to the arsenals of the world, making them a near ubiquitous symbol of modern militaries for years, and probably decades to come.